may wonder why I'm not sketching as I usually have, or have on every other occasion that we've kept this Sunday evening appointment. I must confess that the whole purpose of the sketchbook was more in the line of a device than anything else. I wasn't terribly eager for you to see what I was drawing, but we did the other 5 shows on film. And it happens that a film camera only holds so much film, and it only goes on so many minutes, and then you have to change film, and I go on more minutes than that. At least I'm scheduled to go on more minutes than that. So in order to change film, we showed you a picture. We pretended it was because it was an illustration. It was a sort of device, as I say. And now, here I am, really in the studio, really talking to you, and no need at all for the sketchbook. And no need to cut away. I was reminded of this today. I was at lunch in the country with the Oliviers, and Vivian Lee showed me an extraordinary book that had come into her possession, a book about Sarah Siddons, great English actress, and she was talking about applause. I'm not confusing the sketchbook with applause, but I'll show you what I mean in a minute, because Vivian copied this out for me, and if I can read her writing, it goes like this. On the first night of my appearance, this is Mrs. Siddons speaking about an appearance in Edinburgh. On the first night of my appearance, I must own I was surprised and not a little mortified at that profound silence, which was a contrast to the bursts of applause I had been accustomed to hear in London. No, not a hand moved until the end of the scene. That's an extraordinary thing, because you see, apparently in the 18th century in London, at every moment, every great speech, there was a burst of applause, or huzzas even, I don't know what, kind of thing that now we expect to hear only at a political rally, or perhaps at a bullfight. I'll go on reading here. She says, not a hand moved until the end of the scene, but then indeed I was amply remunerated. Yet while I admire the fine taste and judgment of this conduct on the part of the audience, that's the Edinburgh audience, as opposed to the London audience, I am free to confess that it renders the task of the actor almost too laborious, because customary interruptions are not only gratifying and cheering, but they are really necessary in order to give one breath and voice, to carry one on through somewhat violent exertions. My goodness, I certainly feel for Mrs. Siddons, because how nice it was on the other 5 shows in this series when I needed a breath or a thought or whatever it might be, quite apart from changing the film. I could impose a little sketch on you, and now I have what I consider to be the ideal conditions of TV broadcasting, or whatever it is. We're alive, that is to say, there's a channel between you watching and I who am attempting to interest you, and there's nothing to break it at all, but very unpleasant and difficult for me, because I can't go away and clear my throat or rest myself from what Mrs. Siddons describes as somewhat violent exertions. Well, another thing I wanted to tell you about, really, was the difference between the Edinburgh and London public, and the fact that Mrs. Siddons found that the Edinburgh public waited to make up its mind, and that the London public was so very enthusiastic. And it's one of the extraordinary things about the theatre and theatre audiences in general, is the great enthusiasm and the volatile and excitable quality of the London audience, something that always comes as a great surprise to Americans and to people from the continent and so on, who expect the English to be very cold. Matter of fact, we were speaking about that at lunch today. There were some non-English and non-American guests at the Oliviers, and some of them were saying how surprised they were to discover that the English public is enthusiastic and warm, because they expect the English people to be cold. Of course, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, it's nonsense that the English people are cold, because, of course, they aren't. It's also nonsense to to think that the English people are I don't know, slow to react in any way. They're slow to show their reactions. We find, we who perform to different publics, only as individuals, but never collectively. Now, you take the Latin public, for example. Now, heaven deliver me from having to ever play in Italy, for example. It's a very unpleasant public. And yet every individual Italian reacts brilliantly to anything that you might say, if it's of any interest at all. They say, oh, wonderful, and so on. But you get a lot of people together in a theater in Rome or Milan or something like that, and they'll say, very nice, and so on. But they don't like the fact that they must sit quietly for 2.5 hours and listen to a group of other people talking. It's a kind of jealousy on the part of the Latin public. They don't like the fact that the actors have the floor without any interruptions at all. And the result is that a great success in Italy or even in France, any Mediterranean country indeed, a great success is celebrated by 3 or 4 mild little rounds of applause, and you go home and everybody says, oh, how well you did. But in the north, in England, indeed all northern countries, the public is extremely enthusiastic because as individuals in private life, they don't permit themselves to be. Because it's entirely untrue, in my view, that the English people are cold. Now, this is an Italian view and a French view and indeed a continental view that the English are cold. But this is a fraud, in my opinion, which the English have perpetrated on the world. The deadpan Englishman is an absolute fake. Because the deadpan is a facade, it's a mask, which is worn by somebody who is very warm-hearted, very quick to react. But I think probably all this thing grew up in the last 150 years because of an English empire, because a lot of semi-savage people had to be controlled and had to be educated in Western ways, and these people had to have in front of them the vision of somebody who couldn't be disturbed by anything. If we'll read what was said about the English in the time of the first Elizabeth, we certainly find that they were not noted for their, even their good manners. Very, very noisy and dreadful people, the kind of troublemakers that we're likely to think of as Americans as being. You know, there come those noisy English, the people used to say. And then the English learned how to behave because they had to and had a big empire. And now they've joined this great vocabulary, this great list of false things that we have about people. As a matter, we were talking about that at lunch. There are so many different opinions about nations. We think that the English are cold, and of course they aren't. We think that the English are sane, and of course they aren't exactly sane. They are wonderfully mad and people of genius and people of immense capacities and potentialities who pretend to be sane in order to conceal from the world their immense plans and schemes. And we think that the Italians are lazy. Now imagine the Italians lazy. They work like beavers. They like work. I remember when I lived in Rome, I had a villa near Rome, and I had some people building a stone wall for me nearby, and they worked all week. And then on Sunday, they brought their wives to show them the walls that they were building. To these workers, it was a very exciting thing. The very work that they were involved in. Of course, the Germans are supposed to be phlegmatic. I don't know how we can still think that the Germans are phlegmatic after what we've been through in the last 12 years or 15 years, but we still do. And we think that the Americans are silent. Look at me, 15 minutes, uninterrupted talk. Nothing an American likes as much as talking. And we think that the French are logical. They aren't logical. They like logic. They wish they were logical. They try to be logical, as the English try to be contained and cold and so on, because I think all of these nations make up the mask that they would like the world to accept. And that brings us to the whole thing about a public and why it is so very gratifying and so very nice to be an actor in England, or to be even a visiting actor as I am. I'm not supposed to talk about the play that I'm doing. That is, theoretically, I'm not supposed to, but since it only has another week to run, it's a limited engagement. I can tell you that somewhere on the West End, in some theater which will be nameless. I'm doing my own dramatization of Moby Dick, and it has been a wonderful experience because, again, playing to this lively and exciting theatrical audience, a public that likes the theater for its own sake and enjoys acting for its own sake. People say, oh, well, wouldn't you rather be in Paris or wouldn't you rather be in New York doing it? But of course, New York is the town where the show matters, the whole show, and the director is the big fellow in New York, and the show, particularly if it has a lot of songs and so on, is the thing. And in Paris, well, that's the town of the playwright, isn't it? As I drive to the theater in, I won't tell you exactly where it is because that'd be against BBC policy, but as I drive to it, I pass a statue to Henry Irving, which stands in front of a hotel called the Garrick Hotel. Now, these are two actors, and there isn't a city in the world where there's a statue to an actor and a hotel named after an actor right next to each other. Indeed, there's nothing even vaguely comparable to it anywhere. That makes it nice to be an actor because you feel that you're in a profession which is taken seriously and which gives pleasure and interest to people. Because, of course, the English keep themselves to themselves and like to see somebody expressing what they don't express. And the Italians and the rest, as I've tried to explain earlier, well, their theater is the marketplace. They have only to open their window, and there's the curtain going up on a whole elaborate and perfectly produced play. And they feel that an organized theatrical performance is in some way in competition to themselves. Well, speaking of Moby Dick, and I have started to speak about it, I would like to tell you that in doing it, I don't know whether it would interest you or not, but it's not by any means the first time that I've done a play on a bare stage. I've always felt that the theater itself is a decoration and an exciting place to be, and so on. So I've done many plays without scenery, that is to say, officially without scenery. And Moby Dick is only one of a list of things that I've done in that style. And one of them was Julius Caesar, which we did in modern dress in New York. I'll tell you this by way of throwing in a funny joke to make it a complete talk. We were doing Julius Caesar on a bare stage with some rostrum and so on, but you saw the back of the theater, as you do in Moby Dick, and you could see the stage door. I'm very grateful that in London this hasn't happened, because one day I was doing Brutus's soliloquy in the Orchard, and it was a matinee, and I was halfway through the soliloquy, and suddenly a figure appeared with a dress suit, what we call a tuxedo in America, holding it like this. And he said, "Can you tell me where Mr. Wells's dressing room is?" This was in front of 1,200 people. I said, that way. He went out with the dinner jacket, and biggest laugh I ever got in the theater. No comedy, nothing could equal it. And about 3 minutes later, just as we were getting back into the tragedy, he came back again and said, "Well, who pays for this?" I said, "Well, I do." So I paid him, and he left. And again, the most wonderful reaction. Well, now it's almost time for me to say goodnight to you. I've been watching the clock, and I see that I have about 40 seconds to say goodnight. I would like to tell you, in those remaining seconds that I have, what a privilege and pleasure it is to be speaking on the television in America, in England, as opposed to so many other countries, because here I am talking to you, and before I began to speak, I not only didn't know what I was going to say, but neither did BBC, and I might have founded a new religion or attempted to overthrow your government. You don't know what I might have done. And how nice it was that you just let me talk to you, and how grateful I am to you for that experience and for the experience of playing in your theater, and how much I look forward to a resumption of all these experiments again next year, if I may please.